Hello. Next to me is Guy Shennan, a solution-focused practitioner, consultant, trainer, author, and also a social activist.
And next to me is Marc Gardiner, a social activist who's a member of the Zebra Collective, based down in the southwest, Devon, Cornwall, and they specialise in, they work towards social justice and environmental justice, and solution-focused practice is one of the things that they do and teach in pursuit of that. And that's how we met.
And as for how we met, just about Guy and myself as a partnership. For a couple of years now, we've been meeting, talking, working together, and really exploring all kinds of ideas about solution focus. What is solution focused? What might it be? Where might it go? And that has included the work towards the creation of the Solution Focused Collective, about which we may speak more during this discussion.
So today we're going to talk about beginnings and just make a connection with technology here. I mean, one, how to put it, one reservation, one issue for us is that we're no experts in technology, IT, doing things online. Although I think we're developing skills quite quickly. For example, I was sort of thrown into doing a one-day workshop with a group of clinical psychology trainees a couple of weeks ago. From having never taught online before to doing the whole one-day workshop was quite something, which I've actually written about because I was so taken by what happened. I wrote a blog post, and perhaps we'll share some links at the end of this conversation. So, Mark, go on. Yeah.
I was just going to say that we, in getting to this point, we started to, like you said there, Guy, we started to learn more about what it takes to present online. And just for example, we began to realize that we need better microphones and so on. But it's a bit difficult to get hold of those things at the moment. So we thought it'd be, let's do something, and let's think in terms of what's good enough and get out and get started. So I wanted to ask you, Guy, what are your best hopes from these conversations, and maybe from this specific conversation?
Well, I'm very excited about doing this. I'm excited about having conversations with you, Mark, and because it's different, it's something new. I think I'm hoping that there's lots of learning ahead. I'm sure there will be. I'm hoping it'll be useful. I mean, obviously, we decided to record this and to make it public. So I'm hoping it'll be useful for anyone that takes the trouble to watch or listen to this. So I hope some new ideas will come from this as well. And that we can break some new ground, at least in our own thinking. Hopefully that might assist with other people's thinking. And yourself, Mark, so what are your best hopes from this in general, from having these conversations?
So unsurprisingly, I guess I'm going to echo a lot of what you said. As a trainer in solution focused, which is probably the main thing I do in my job, I'm repeatedly saying to participants how I learn every time I train, and what a privileged position it is to be a solution focused trainer, because it gives you that chance to be constantly thinking about it, answering tough questions, articulating the subtleties and all of that. So for me, having a focused conversation like this will promote my learning and my understanding of solution focused, and I guess what matters to me and what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to do it well.
Okay, and you also asked me, Mark, what my best hopes are for today's conversation. And as you just mentioned, doing it well. I'm hoping that this goes well enough, if you like. And just to echo your point about, we were trying to get hold of a microphone that a colleague, a friend of mine, had recommended as being a good microphone for podcasts, and it doesn't seem to be available at the moment. And I'm not sure if that's because it's been discontinued or because of the current situation we're in. So I hope it goes well enough, technology-wise. people can hear us, see us if we put this out as a video rather than podcast, and that we sort of make some sort of sense, that we're coherent enough as well as we begin this. So, do you want to say a bit about the topic of beginnings, Mark, that we've chosen?
So, yeah, what's clear to us and a lot of people who are interested in solution focus and engage with it is that the beginning of the solution focus process is rich, it's active, it's essential, it's absolutely key to it is the foundation of a good solution focus process. So we think that there's real value in having a bit of a chat about it from our perspectives and our sort of overlapping but distinct perspectives as well. So Guy, I'm going to ask you to share this quotation that I know is inspirational to you, and when you introduced it to me, yeah, I love it. So let's hear it.
And it was a quotation from Edward Said. It was professor of English literature at Columbia University in New York. It was his professional life was literature, English in particular. And he was also a prominent Palestinian intellectual and public figure as well. And well, he wrote in his book Orientalism, beginnings have to be made for each project in such a way as to enable what follows from them. So beginnings have to be made. And so one thing that I've been thinking a lot about beginnings since we decided to talk about beginnings in this conversation. And it strikes me that a beginning can be an arbitrary point, in a sense. And Edward Said is saying we have to make a beginning. It's not, a beginning doesn't just exist in some natural sort of fashion. You know, when did the world begin? You know, and you know, we might think, when just jumping ahead to the conversation we're about to have about solution-focused practice and thinking about the therapy context, solution-focused therapy, it might seem to a therapist that something begins at the beginning of a therapy session, and yet a client, and that's the beginning of the therapist's contact or relationship with a particular client, because a client is coming in not at a beginning. Well, it's one beginning of the therapy. It's maybe not the beginning of a change process. Certainly that's something that solution-focused practice has helped us to think about, that change is already underway. And that's something that Buddhism helped solution-focused people to think about, that change is always happening. Change is always happening. When did a certain change begin? You know, so that's the sort of sense that I'm trying to get at about it could be seen as arbitrary. If change is always happening, if you look at a change that's taking place or a change that has happened, when did that change start? Well, so beginnings have to be made for each project. I don't know if Edward Said was seen as a social constructionist, but that seemed like a social constructionist idea, that we construct beginnings in such a way as to enable what follows from them. It sort of reminds me of perhaps the more everyday saying, start as you mean to go on. So beginnings, beginnings are really important, you know. Start as you mean to go on. They signal, the way we begin with talking to people signals something about what we think is important and how we are and how we do things. Hoping that makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, and I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that one of the attractions of solution focused is the, you know, being aware of the assumptions that we're operating with and kind of keeping them to a minimum. And so at the outset, you've used the word therapy, Guy, which is fine. I tend to use the word worker because most of my background is in using solution focused outside the sort of formal psychotherapy room. So the worker getting alongside somebody, trying to keep their assumptions about what's the job to a minimum, and finding out from the person uh, and yeah, finding out from the person what their thoughts are about why they're here, and what this is the beginning of, and then beginning to negotiate a kind of deal for the job.
Okay, okay, sure. And I think we're sort of signalling a few of the things that are going to come in as our conversation develops. And we thought we would say a little bit about maybe how, in terms of how solution-focused conversations begin, how they are done by the practitioner, our thoughts, our experiences, our ideas about how this developed, first at Milwaukee and later at Brief and other places, and then how we work.
So if I just begin with, again, this is my journey into solution focus, and as a trainer, you tend to say the same things a lot and use the same resources a lot, and I guess that can begin to influence your thinking around what solution focused is. So I've more than any other resource, I guess, is a video of Steve Shazer working with a client. So Steve Shazer being one of the founders of Solution Focus in Milwaukee, and the wording he uses early on in this first conversation is, he said, "I want to thank you for coming here today. I hope it's helpful to you in some way. There's no guarantee of that, but I do guarantee that I'll be doing my best, and I assume that you will too. And we'll see what happens." And then there's that, and then just after that, he says something along the lines of, he says something like, "Speaking of that, how will you know that our conversation has been useful? Maybe not today, but maybe in a few days' time. How will you know that this was worth doing, that it wasn't a waste of time?" So the way I've tended to talk about that has been that has it's starting the conversation and beginning to negotiate. What is the job here? What's the deal? And I think there's both, how are we going to work? How you can expect, kind of how, what's the culture of this conversation? And that's all. I'll just very quickly. I hope it's helpful to you. There's no guarantee of that. That real explicitly saying, I can't give guarantees of outcome. However, I can guarantee I'll be doing my best. So the worker saying, I'm absolutely in this. I'm 100% kind of present and giving myself to what's important to you. And then immediately says, and I assume that you will too. And that's explicit about, this is collaborative, this is kind of co-creating something, it's not me fixing you. And we'll see what happens. So that's something about what you can expect in the way of working. And then that question, how will you know that this has been helpful, begins to, I think, begins to create, or it's the beginning of creating the deal for this work. And the word I haven't used yet is the contract. Guy.
So yeah. Well, that's sort of, I was thinking of talking about my beginnings in solution-focused practice and how my understanding of my practice at the beginning of a piece of solution-focused work is developed, and mention of contract sort of brings me to Brief, really, because I think it was probably Brief while I was working at Brief, while sort of contracting metaphors. I think it's a metaphor sort of came into being. But let me just backtrack a little bit, and it's just great to hear, this sort of the way that Steve Shazer would say that, all that you said, and at the end, the question that that he said on the video that you're using your training, how will you know that this has been helpful or useful? And perhaps not today, perhaps in a few days' time. And even just adding, you know, in a few days' time, I think it's clarifying that the question is seeking an outcome, but it's not about sort of process. And so this is one of many things I learned at Brief, this separation or distinction between process and outcome. And it's a distinction that, you know, is often muddied, and many, you know, of the greatest solution-focused practitioners, I think, have got muddied in this, or muddied this distinction at times between process and outcome. And that the intention at the beginning of a solution-focused piece of work with the beginning question is to ask about, you know, outcome, you know, at some point in the future, how will you know this has been useful? Rather than what are your best hopes for what we could do together today, for example, which is a more process question. And so, of course, what's famous now about the way Brief developed this part of the process is, I was just thinking when you were talking about Milwaukee and the song "What Made Milwaukee Famous," and so one thing that's made Brief famous is what's now called the best hopes question. And so I first heard Chris Iverson asking a client, watching him work on video on a training course that he ran back in 1999, 21 years ago. It's astonishing. What are your best hopes from our work together, or from this? And I remember when I first heard that phrase, I thought, that's very odd. It sounds a bit odd. I've never heard people talk in that way before. And soon find myself asking this question myself. And that is my favorite way of beginning a piece of solution-focused work. But I tend to say something like, so once I get to the point of asking the question, so what are your best hopes from our work together? How would you know this has been useful? Asking two questions for the price of one, I find myself doing, and sometimes think that might be helpful to the client if they miss the first question. It sort of clarifies it by underlining it and putting it into slightly different words. But they're both questions about outcome. What are your best hopes from this? And so yes, so when I worked at Brief in the early, again, this is quite a long time ago, there was sort of discussions about how to frame this, maybe for teaching purposes. One idea was that came more from Evan was the idea of a commission. The client is commissioning the worker, and so the word commission was sort of thought about as a metaphor. And I think contracting, in my memory, comes more from Chris, and I would sort of, this was something that appealed to me, that we were contracting. So rather than the client commissioning the worker and client were contracting together. I can see that's still got quite a lot of appeal. I sort of dropped the idea of contract myself now, because maybe contracting as a verb fits with how I sort of feel and see things. But the idea of a contract, like the idea of a goal, is a bit sort of thing-like. It's sort of, to me, it evokes certain ideas about a thing, and writing down a contract is a bit static, maybe. And I just thought, and thinking about it, I thought maybe this isn't fully necessary. And so I now talk about, at the beginning of a piece of work, just establishing a direction for the work, establishing a forward direction. Forward, that's meaning towards what the person hopes for rather than what they don't, you know, what the person wants rather than what they don't want. And I like the idea of direction because it sort of highlights or emphasizes or brings in the idea of movement. And so what are your best hopes from coming here? I don't know. I'm feeling a bit low at the moment. Okay, so what are your best hopes from our talking? You know, how do you know it was useful? Well, I'd like to just not feel quite so bad. You know? Okay, so how would you like to be instead? Well, I'd like to be feeling better about things. Okay, so if you were feeling better about things, that would make our talking useful. Yeah, I guess so. So for me, what's happened there is that a direction for the work towards the person feeling better has been established. And yeah, so that's roughly how I see what I'm doing at the moment. Just a conversation with the person who comes for the solution focused work, to establish a direction for the work, whether it's towards feeling better or whatever else it becomes.
Yeah. So that's really interesting listening, particularly the stuff around contract and contracting, and thought-provoking for me, because I've got into a kind of habit, I suppose, of I'm still really using the word contract, and I like it, and it seems to resonate when I'm introducing these ideas to people. But I'm quite taken with what you're saying, Guy. I think for me, one of the things I like to say when I'm introducing these ideas is that it's a bit of a bold proposition, actually. As I say it now, I'm testing it in my head. But that, in a sense, almost every exchange between human beings has an implicit contract. There's a kind of understanding. What's the deal? You know, when you say hello to people, that they say hello back, and you know, there's almost a kind of implicit agreement about how we interact, and that I suppose the more that is at stake in any particular exchange, it seems to me, the more value there is in making the contract or the deal explicit, so that we minimize the risk. I want to turn over, minimize the risk of going up blind alleys and sort of miscommunicating. I thought I was doing this, I thought we were doing that. Whereas being explicit from the outset about what we are doing, and yes, clarity about what the person wants from this, the change they want, or whatever it is they want, and then an opportunity for us as workers to be able to give that clarity of saying, for example, that just, you know, kind of to be clear, that's not something that we can do here. However, ... So I think, you know, people do come looking for help with all kinds of weird and wonderful beliefs about what's possible, and that early, or very early negotiation around, you know, what's the deal here, seems to me it sets you know, really well held beginnings set the beginning of the path that is going to be more likely to be useful to somebody. I think one of the anxieties I've had about the word contract has been it's so kind of, maybe even more so with the word commissioning there, is it's so, for me, sort of tied up with commerce and you know, kind of, and capitalism maybe. But then I'm kind of reassured when I pull back from that and think that contracting as an idea is distinct. And yes, it's used within commerce, but it's also used in other concepts. And my philosophical pursuits in the past, I think about Rousseau and the social contract as a use of that term within kind of political theory. And I guess this maybe relates back to the Edward Said quotation, Guy, that a very useful thing that you're doing in this early stage is kind of delimiting the work, which is a very helpful thing to do. This isn't everything. This is something specific. And the more it kind of is honed to be clear, this is what we're pursuing, the clearer it is what we're not doing, and that much more useful as a result. I can see you want to say something about that.
No, well, I'm just, it's very rich to me what you're saying, Mark, and I'm anxious about losing some of my thoughts in response to you, to what you're saying. And I'm going to go right back to, well, actually, I was thinking of a guy called Pete McCarthy and McCarthy's Bar. I like the juxtaposition in my head of Rousseau and the social contract, and Pete McCarthy, who wrote this wonderful book called McCarthy's Bar. I don't know much about him. He's maybe a journalist, but he wrote a book that was very funny about visiting Ireland and searching for ancestors, or searching for forebears his family came from Ireland. And there's just a very funny moment when he talks about Irish bars, Irish pubs, and how you have conversations are sort of, you know, you have to have conversations in Irish bars. And he wrote something like, when you step into a bar in Ireland, you are signing an implicit contract that you will have conversation. That is the deal. And so you can't stand at a bar, stand at the bar in an Irish bar, and then someone talks to you and sort of not respond. You've got to. It's the deal. And so I like what you said right at the beginning of what you were saying there about every human interchange or exchange is actually, there's a deal being struck. I think you said something like that. And maybe so every time, if I was to go out for my daily exercise later on today, and I think this is happening a bit more actually, even here in personal London, that you sort of walk past somebody on the street and you might say hello to that person. We sort of pride ourselves as people from up north that this happens on the streets in Lancashire, that at bus stops people actually talk to each other. But then, I don't know, is this, so even just saying hello to someone, there's a deal being struck, or we are agreeing to have an interchange? I don't know. That's so. Of course, you wouldn't talk about a contract in such a moment, because it makes the sort of that too heavy, too big. You know, just two people saying hello to each other. Pete McCarthy was sort of joking about it. Where you're signing an implicit contract to have conversations when you walk into an Irish bar, but then the metaphor contract works really nicely there. And so, yeah. So there is. Yeah, so I like what you're saying about the clarity that I think solution-focused practice brings to a conversation. The attention it gives to finding out and asking someone what they want, what they hope for, and seeing that as a contract, I think, does maybe give it some weight.
Yeah. Listening to you, it just occurred to me a couple of examples of a very specific one and then a more general one. Down in Cornwall, there is a very experienced solution-focused practitioner called Alyssa Razavi, who up until recently was a special educational needs coordinator within the council. And there's a lot of solution-focused activity within sections of the early help, children's, families, schools services. And I've heard her say for years that contracting is, in her experience, the most important part of her solution-focused practice, because getting that clarity with the individuals, families, parents, whoever that she's working with, it does, as she says, I got the concept of not going up cul-de-sacs from her in that context. And then the general one is we're engaged in doing some large-scale, long-term attempts at solution-focused culture change with Devon County Adult Social Care, and I'm training their staff. And again, that's what I'm hearing so much, is that maybe it's that something about context. You know, people who are in receipt of statutory services and may have a mixture of motivations to be involved, whether they want to be or whether they're made to be, or whether and also what the hell they think this is about. And so that the levels of unclarity, I like that word, in people at the start, it can be really significant. So workers will say to me, yeah, that's so useful that if right from the start we can help people to be clear about what we can and can't offer.
No, yeah, and your mention of, you know, the Devon Adult Social Care and what Alyssa said as well, it's just took me back to when I first began using solution-focused practice, when I was a social worker in a social services department 25 years ago, and I was in a duty team, and so sometimes we're just fielding telephone calls from people, and it wasn't always clear to me sometimes why somebody had phoned, and why wasn't it clear to me? Well, maybe because of the questions I didn't ask, or And so when I was trained in solution focused practice, it did have a very useful impact on some of my duty telephone call conversations, because I would start to ask, I'm hearing someone is in distress, or someone who, you know, clearly had some difficulties, and we were finding it hard between us to find a way for that person to express to me what those difficulties were, and the conversation might become confused. And I started to ask, so can I just check, you know, when you decided to phone, or what needs to happen for this phone call to be helpful to you? That was the way that I first learned to ask this question, by the way, from my early training. What needs to happen for this to be useful? You can see the possible confusion of process and outcome there. You know, what needs to happen? What do I need to do for you? You know. But anyway, so what were you hoping for would come from this telephone call, and that often just enables some clarity to, just what you're saying. Okay, should we shift on to